Hi, Josh.
Hi, Brink. How are you today?
I'm doing good.
Good.
Beautiful weather here in D.C. We had just a stretch of 75-degree days, crisp, cloudless, fantastic.
You know, it's the same here. Although the environment, the weather, it's so people talk about it too much here. So I have a personal ban on any kind of lifestyle commentary.
Yeah.
But I'm breaking the ban for just a moment.
But and you've just come out from Boston relatively recently, so you're not blasé about having all that stunning weather.
I'm not completely blasé about it, but it's interesting what they say about the weather. I live in San Francisco, though I come to Palo Alto for my day job, and the weather in San Francisco is, as people describe it,
yes,
crazy, wild, windy, cold, etc., but beautiful too.
So what are we going to talk about today?
Well, I thought we might start with your new, what can I say, rock star status on The Daily Show. I watched the segment. You did well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I thought you looked good, spoke well, and it was kind of an interesting conversation. Let me just fill people in.
Right.
So Brink was on with Jon Stewart to talk about that is Brink's book, The Age of Abundance.
Which I have here somewhere, and we'll show for the cameras. Yeah. There you go.
I have
in bookstores now.
I wish I had it. I would advertise it for you, but I have it in my home office.
I'm sufficiently shameless. I've done it.
That's good. In case, let me, to spare you shamelessness, let me summarize the book if I can.
Sure.
I'll try. If I get it wrong, you'll correct me. So the book tries to tie the kind of cultural libertarianism that emerges in the 1960s in the United States, tie that to the the post-war economic prosperity. The central idea, as I understand it, is that economic prosperity, sustained economic growth, relieved the pressures of economic necessity from large portions of the population, and as a consequence of that, enabled people to, what can we say, consume more of what had been traditionally been thought to be luxury goods for the rich, namely, as the slogan goes, sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Right. So that's a good summary. The psychologist Abraham Maslow had his famous hierarchy of needs, and I borrow that concept in my book, that you start out with the very basic needs for survival and security, and if those aren't being satisfied, you really can't think about anything else. But if those are in the bag and you can take them for granted, you don't run out of worries. You start worrying about new things. You start worrying about having friends and being loved and fitting into the community and so forth. And if those things, if you lack those, you really can't think about anything else. But if those are satisfied, you start thinking about other things, in particular, meaning of life, quality of life, personal fulfillment, what Maslow called self-actualization. And in my telling of post-war American history, by the 50s, we were in a position to basically take survival and security for granted. And so that was a state of affairs that was utterly novel in human history, but people didn't stop worrying. It wasn't paradise. People just started worrying about new stuff. And in particular, all kinds of new values and new priorities came to the surface, especially all of the social and cultural tumults of the 60s and 70s, which I lay at the door of capitalist-created prosperity. And the kind of plot of the book comes from the fact that the people at the forefront of exploring the new possibilities of mass affluence, the people at the pushing for civil rights and feminism and environmentalism and sex, drugs, and rock and roll, hedonism, were people of the left who tended to despise the capitalism that had created the prosperity which had created all these new possibilities. Meanwhile, the people on the right who were defending capitalism defended it because they defended all traditions they had been brought up with, and so they were precisely the kind of people who were most likely to be freaked out by all the cultural dynamism that capitalism was creating. So I come in with the happy libertarian synthesis of being comfortable with economic change and economic dynamism and cultural change and cultural dynamism. And my argument is that American society, after all the Sturm und Drang of the 60s and 70s, has been settling down into a more kind of libertarianish cultural synthesis in the past couple of decades. So that's my story.
Yeah, it's as Brecht said, first the bread, then the morals. That's
yes.
a variant of the story. John Stuart Mill, similarly, first you have to take care of the basic material needs, and then the next in want and importance, Mill said, is personal liberty. I'm sure the story, of course, has to be a little bit more complicated than that, because I wouldn't have described the 1950s in the United States, or for that matter the 1960s, as a period in which there was a powerful sense of security, particularly because of the overhanging threat of nuclear conflict.
Right, of course that's right. I mean simply material security, that you've got a full belly and you're not worried about having an empty belly tomorrow.
Right, and even there, I guess the story would have to be, as I'm sure as it is, a little bit more complicated because of a persistent sense of fragility and risk about the availability of basic goods, including not just bread, though that's the first in order, but health and a decent education and
yes,
some kind of job.
Right. Of course, we all continue to have material needs. We all continue to feel stretched. We all continue to struggle to make ends meet because we keep ratcheting up our expectations the more resources we have. But grading on a world curve, grading on a historical curve, the prosperity that Americans have enjoyed since World War II is something that stands out as something new under the sun. And I try to do as much nuance and caveats as I can. I go on for 400 pages, but I had to squeeze it all into 5 minutes with Jon Stewart and try to be at least moderately entertaining while doing it. And it was great. It was great fun.
Yeah, and there was a good point that he made, and I feel as I reflect on it, I feel like I ought to be accused myself of this, where it's a sort of a joke. It's not only a joke, but to emphasize the sex, drugs, and rock and roll part of the story. But what happened, I should just tell people what happened on the show, was that you first said something about civil rights, feminism, women's equality, and environmentalism. And then when you said sex, drugs, and rock and roll, people started applauding. Yes. Jon Stewart made a joke out of it, but he was also making a serious point, which was people were paying attention to the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or, sex,
right.
drugs, and reggaeton part of the story. And we're not paying attention to what is arguably an even more serious part of the story, which is, if I can put it this way, the material basis of the great social movements of the 1950s and 1960s in the United States, and not just in the United States, because this is a comparative story as well, about, in the United States, racial equality, but a broader feminist movement and environmentalist movement. I guess what I think is that your telling of the story is an argument that, so to speak, libertarian, the kind of mix of economic and cultural libertarianism that you have is, so to speak, on the side of history, that economic growth makes the mix of a less regulated economy and a less regulated culture and society a particularly attractive mix. And I guess if we were pushing harder on this, I think that we'd have to get into the issues about what you do about the persistent risks that people feel who in areas about their standards of living, their employment security, health care, education, and then global issues as well, including issues about nuclear security and about climate change, the other issues that we've talked about some. So I think the story, there's a version of the story that seems kind of right to me, which is there is a kind of global shift in a more culturally libertarian direction
in making that point, I was not trying in any way to be original. It's a wholly unoriginal point, and I think the person who's been most on top of documenting is the political scientist Ronald Inglehart at the University of Michigan, who has for decades conducted these surveys on social attitudes in dozens of countries and finds a very clear-cut correlation between rising per capita GDP and changing attitudes about a whole host of things, including what he calls sort of post-materialist attitudes, where people start valuing good experiences and meaningful experiences over just more money and more stuff. A greater skepticism towards authority, greater secularism, all kinds of
but we do have the interesting
values
case
that goes
there.
together under kind of cultural liberalism.
We do have the interesting case there of the religiosity in the United States as a countervailing fact. In most places, the country gets richer, it gets less religious, and as you go up the income scale, there's less religiosity. The United States looks very different from that. Some people think the United States is on the cutting edge of a resurgence of religiosity, even among people who are wealthy and in wealthy countries. I'm a little bit skeptical.
Yeah, that's a big kettle of fish. Clearly, America is an outlier as compared to Europe in terms of the degree to which religiosity has held its own in the face of modernization and prosperity. But still, I think the U.S. follows the trend. From my reading, the most careful parsing of the data shows that there is ongoing secularization. The percentage of people who are unchurched has been going up over time. The percentage of people who are sort of intensely religious is going down over time. So I think America fits into that story.
There's an interesting survey that we reported in the latest Boston Review. In the spirit of advertisements for self, I'll hold this up here.
Yes.
And we'll talk some more about some of the other elements in the issue later on, about issues about Iran. This is a survey reporting results of what's called, I guess appropriately enough, the Bliss Institute at the University of Akron. John Green is the director, and he provided us with the data. One of the things that's very interesting is that 11% of Americans, according to the survey, call themselves members of the religious right. 7% describe themselves as members of the religious left.
Yes.
Very small difference between religious right and religious left. 51% say that religion provides much guidance in their life. 46% that say that religion is important to how they vote. But very interestingly, this is a reason for caution in talking in very generic terms about religion.
Right.
Of the Americans who call themselves highly religious, this will be good news to you. It's certainly good news to me. Of Americans who call themselves highly religious, only 10% believe in converting others to their religion.
And that number's gone way down over time too.
Way down.
Yeah.
And of Americans, this is even more telling, interesting, and again, I'm sure will be congenial to you. I know it's congenial to me. Of Americans who call themselves highly religious, those who believe in changing aspects of society to conform to their religious beliefs, only 6%.
That's interesting.
I think it's that's the most. I think it's the most striking finding. And
early,
it also,
go ahead.
Just the last point is that there's also an interesting trend, suggestive trend between 2002 and 2006, that Americans who are more weekly religious, weekly meaning that they attend church services, religious services less than once a week, there's been a non-trivial shift in that group towards the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
That's a more immediate trend. But I think on these other things that the people emphasize the high degree of religiosity in the United States, appropriately so. But I think this interesting disparity between people who think of religion as important in their own life, and people who think that they want to convert other people, or that it's important that the society conform to their religion. It's a very small.
I agree.
Very small number.
Yeah.
Speaking of people who for whom religion is important in their own life, that was a segue.
Okay.
John Ashcroft.
Yes.
Savior of the Republic.
New hero. Yes.
Yeah, our
indeed,
great national hero. The idea that John Ashcroft on drugs is better than
as a firmer grasp of the Constitution. Yes.
Straight and sober. Every time I've read the stories.
Well, let's back up and tell viewers in case they don't know what we're talking about.
Sorry. The issue of the reauthorization of NSA spying came up. I guess this was in 2004 when Ashcroft was still Attorney General, but Ashcroft was then had pancreatitis, I think. He's in the hospital. He's been operated on. He's drugged up. The acting Attorney General, Comey, says, we are not reauthorizing this program. There are too many bad features of it. What bad features? Nobody will say. Secrets. Can't tell you what the bad features were, but they were sufficiently bad that the Attorney General's office didn't want to reauthorize the spying program.
Right.
The bright idea in the Office of the Legal Counsel of the President, where Gonzales is sitting before he becomes Attorney General, is we'll circumvent the acting Attorney General. We'll get the real Attorney General in the hospital, drugged up. We'll get him to sign the reauthorization.
Yeah, so Gonzales and Andy Card, the chief of staff at the time, drive out to Ashcroft, and then Comey finds out about it, and he dashes off to the hospital to beat them there, and actually, it was on the same episode of The Daily Show that I appeared on. They had a fantastic. They dramatized this whole scene using clips from Mexican soap operas because it was just that lurid and insane. But
completely insane. As a colleague of mine in the law school here said, this is a colleague who served in the Reagan administration. Said, if this had happened in a Latin American country, it would have been called an attempted coup.
Yeah. No.
I was thinking of scenes not from Mexican soap operas, but from The Godfather, and the protection of Don Corleone while he's in the hospital, and racing to the hospital because the protection has been removed. Complete lunacy. But a serious
Ashcroft was
thing.
a good guy. He said, he said, I'm not the Attorney General. That guy over there is the Attorney General, pointing at Comey, and at any rate...
and he was right. And Ashcroft is I'm sure... is a complicated figure. People make fun of him. Some people, more secular people make fun of him. Member of the Assemblies of God, anointed with Mazola oil. He was very much opposed to racial profiling. Thought it should be, understood it as being unconstitutional. But he also is not. He's no Brink Lindsey, Cato Institute libertarian.
No.
Very big on the war on drugs, particularly the marijuana part of the war on drugs. Didn't want to appear in the Great Hall of Justice next to those nude statues of men and women.
Right.
Wanted them cloaked. And a big, not a supporter of, writer of, elaborator of the Patriot Act, criticized the librarians for being hysterical when they didn't like some provisions in the Patriot Act. So not a great libertarian, but he emerges. Every time I read one of these stories about this, I have to read it twice because I can't quite get it through my mind maybe a limitation of me, that John Ashcroft emerges as one of the heroes of this story. But here's the thing that I'm curious about this, Brink. So there you are. You're in some broad and general sense, a Hayekian classical liberal.
Yes.
For you, the rule of law is really, really, really a big deal.
Absolutely.
Huge deal. I mean, for all of us it is, but I think this is the centerpiece of Hayekian classical liberalism is the view that the rule of law is the salvation of our liberty. This set of events, the NSA spying program itself, but even more fundamentally, the efforts to reauthorize it, the efforts to circumvent the legitimate authority and reauthorize it, this strikes me as about as fundamental assault on the rule of law as you can get.
Yeah, go ahead.
Have you been writing about this? Are you as upset about this as I think you ought to be?
I think so, and I think that Cato, to its great credit, has been on the ball on this issue for some time. There's a wonderful white paper that Cato put out, I guess, about a year ago, called "Power Surge" by Gene Healy and Tim Lynch, that just gives chapter and verse on the woeful oversteps of authority and power grabs by the Bush administration, and it was just complete contempt for the constitutional and statutory restrictions on its power. So I would say that at this point, why hasn't this crazy, lurid story generated more outrage than it has? At this point, we've kind of the stock's already been driven down to zero. So where do you go? After when you hear more bad news, and so
well, you could support impeachment.
Yeah, you could, but I would counsel against that move. I think that Bush has been politically neutered by the combination of the 2006 elections and the Democratic takeover of Congress.
Well, not completely politically neutered. I mean, you look what happened on the Iraq spending.
No, as much
Democrats,
as much as he can be, given our separations of power systems, he is dead in the water and has as little room for maneuver as any president you can think of. And he's not going to get impeached. It's just not going to happen because he's on his way out anyway. And I fear that the ultimate result of such a move would be to simply stir the Republican base in the same kind of way that for less cause, I will grant, the Republican jihad against Clinton ended up backfiring. I fear that even with high motives and good intentions, an attempt to officially kill this guy who's already politically dead isn't going to work. And so we're stuck in an exasperating situation, which is we've got 18 months left with this guy who has lost the confidence of the country, has lost the confidence of the other branches of government, and yet has the constitutional power to still do his thing. And it's
a lot of damage.
It's not
a lot of damage.
No, it's not a good state to be in.
You probably saw the story in yesterday's Times about the secret surge, the hidden surge that they're really pushing. They're basically doubling the combat troop levels in Iraq over the course of the year, because not only are they putting in the surge forces, but they're sending guys back for additional, guys and men and women back, soldiers back for additional rotations, and keeping people there longer. So it's finally they're going to be approaching the troop levels that Shinseki was laid off for proposing back in 2003, but doing it unannounced at the very time that the power is very weak. I don't mean I haven't been involved in any impeachment efforts. I sort of share your view about that, but I think this is a disastrous situation.
It is, but it's also because there isn't any real clear exit strategy for the Bush administration, at least prior to January 20th, 2009. You hear these new horror stories or these whatever latest blunder or outrage, and I get the feeling that, going back before maybe some of our viewers will remember, but the first season of Saturday Night Live, they would continually interrupt their news broadcasts with this latest bulletin that Generalissimo Francisco Franco is still dead. He had died. He had died that spring, and they just led with that all season long. Yeah. And the Bush administration still stinks. That's what do you do with it when you hear it for the nth time?
Yeah. Well, it's worth. But I know. I don't think you disagree about this, but I just want to emphasize that it's not just that they stink.
Right. No, right.
There's stinking is stinking. An assault on the Constitution is worse, even worse, way worse. Than
no, and it's extremely disturbing and depressing to see the political right, which professes to care about the rule of law and limitations on centralized power, and was certainly exercised about instances in which the Clinton administration played fast and loose with the rules, to then just go over into lapdog mode. At least not all of them. Absolutely, but many have just kind of gone into tribal, Team Red mode, and the fearless leader can do no wrong, and that's that's not good. So, but we're.
And what about the next round of?
Yeah, so now we're going to replace this guy, and so we've got the 2008 field, and we've talked. The last time we did a Blogging Heads segment, we talked about the Democrats. They had just had their first debate. The Republicans have had a couple, and the campaign is, in full swing here, long before we're going to do anything about it. But tell me, if some genie came to you and told you, look, I can see the future, a Republican is going to win in 2008. There's nothing that can be done about that. But the nominee is still up for grabs, and you get to pick him. Who, Josh Cohen, man of the left, would you hold your nose and pull the lever for?
Probably no shock, but Giuliani.
Yeah.
Did that word just come out of my mouth?
Yeah, good.
Yeah. Without even missing a beat. I mean, so Romney. Awful. Although the Massachusetts healthcare stuff that he did that was a good thing. I like that.
I don't even like that very much.
But okay. I mean, showed a willingness to do something creative and interesting on an important problem. We could talk about the details of it or not. But running as a presidential candidate.
But he hasn't run on that at all. He hasn't run on being a problem solver.
He hasn't run it at all. He's run on the three-legged stool of strong, strong, strong.
Right.
What is it? Strong military, strong family, strong economy.
Right.
Maybe he'll tell some story about how improved health care is good for a strong economy, but it's way down on his list.
No, he's running as something that he isn't, which is a movement social conservative, and he's just come off as a hopeless phony.
He comes off as a hopeless phony, and he's stuck in single digits, and my guess is that he's going to stay in single digits. And I just can't get myself to believe that it's because people don't like his Mormonism. They don't like him. They think he's a fraud, and if you want somebody, if you're going to go the strong route, and you're looking for somebody who's strong on security, strong on the military,
right.
What possible reason would you have for picking a Romney who has absolutely zero experience? You'd probably pick Mr. Bomb Iran,
right.
John McCain. It's unfortunate that idiotic performance about Bomb Iran doesn't disqualify him. And if that didn't disqualify him, his remarks, I guess it was in the second debate about he'd happily be the last guy standing in Iraq. He thinks it's that important. Getting out of there quickly and with some decency is so important. It's just hard for me to see somebody who's taken this strong. It's hard to stop a war that you started, and he's so implicated in having started it and supporting its continuation that I just don't see him as a plausible finisher that war. And so I say, if you're looking for somebody who could possibly do something, more sensible on Iraq, more sensible than the other Republican candidates, who's not going to fill up the Supreme Court with more lovers of authority and who might be prepared to do something more creative and interesting on issues about health and education. And I think on those dimensions, Giuliani does look better. But you must agree with that.
Well, I mean, first on Romney, just at my most cynical, I would say that his complete lack of sincerity is sort of appealing to me in contrast to the current administration. I'm kind of tired of true believers. So someone who will just twist with the wind, maybe that's not so bad relative to what we've been through. But
you and Montaigne singing the praises of hypocrisy.
But seriously, he's just I think running a strategically dumb race where he's running as something that he transparently isn't, and that has undercut a lot of what he had going for him, which was an accomplished doer in the real world. And so, as far as McCain is concerned, I would say that to his credit in the most recent debate, he was the only one who wasn't sort of giddy with excitement about torturing people.
Absolutely.
And since he's clearly been through it, he knows what it's like, and he's been, I think, quite brave in drawing the line and making a clear distinction that this isn't a line that America should cross. Unfortunately, in their kind of cult of swagger and machismo these days, you've got Tom Tancredo saying we need Jack Bauer and from the 24 TV show, and Romney saying he wants to double Guantanamo, whatever in the world that means. So on that score, on that very basic moral issue, I think that McCain looks good. But as you said, he is so wedded to the war in Iraq, which we can talk about a little bit later. Generally, the foreign policy vibe coming out of the Republican candidates is turning me off. But his kind of blindness to what has happened in Iraq and therefore what needs to happen in Iraq, I think, is disturbing. Giuliani, on the plus side, he's clearly a real break from the red state Republican-based social conservatism stuff, which has always been my least favorite thing about the modern GOP. On the minus side, he too is doing this chest-thumping, machismo thing on foreign policy, and of course he's just endlessly cashing in on being, the mayor of 9/11, and that kind of wears on me after a while. And there's a weirdness to his running so heavily on being a tough guy and a man of strength in a post-9/11 world when, he's been mayor of New York City and has no foreign policy experience whatsoever. So, again, my cynical side, I'm comforted a little bit that maybe he doesn't mean any of that stuff, that he's just deploying some very vague tough guy rhetoric to soothe the base and to make up for his deviations from political correctness on other fronts, and that perhaps he'll be more sober and pragmatic in office.
That's my sense about him, and I guess I think there's each one of these guys, I mean Giuliani and McCain, they do the chest thumping thing, and they also have the I'm my own guy, independent, not beholden to anybody. I think Giuliani is able to carry that off a little bit better than McCain. McCain, I agree with you on the torture point. There's Romney talking about enhanced interrogation techniques. That means that's a kind of code word for I like waterboarding.
Yep.
Just awful. McCain good on that, but McCain, despite his McCain-Feingold and despite his views on the immigration issue, has been in the suck-up race himself lately, and he's been running pretty fast in it, doing pretty well.
I would
not
say,
quite the champion that Romney is, but
to me the difference between the difference between McCain and Giuliani on foreign policy hawkishness, they're both trying to sound tough, and I don't think that that approach really makes a lot of sense right now. But there's a specificity to McCain's rhetoric that is utterly lacking in Giuliani's rhetoric. Giuliani just talks about going on offense and not going back on defense, and what in the world does that mean? It just sounds right, I think, or it's supposed to sound right to hawkish Republican primary voters, but there's not a lot of there.
And that's good.
That's good as far as I'm concerned. The thing that puts me off about Giuliani and makes me quite hesitant about ultimately supporting him is he does. My first memories of him are doing grandstanding perp walks of Wall Street traders back in the 80s, and he does have I think, an authoritarian streak that equates his will with the way it's got to be, and sort of my way or the highway approach to very confrontational governance strategy in New York City, which may have been the only way to get things done in that ungovernable mess at that time. So he's got, I think, some sort of temperamental flaws that may have been functional in his job as mayor of New York, but may play much less well as leader of the most powerful country in the world.
I agree with you about that, though. In the race for temperamental flaws, I think McCain is still running way ahead.
Well, there you go. That's
and I also think that, agree on Giuliani's authoritarian streak. I'm not going to vote for him. I'm not enthusiastic about him. The idea that it was his strategy of beating up on the squeegee men that drove down crime rates in New York when crime rates were going down in every other major city, and everybody had their own story about why they were going down in their own city. So there was some general pattern, and I don't think it was beating up squeegee men. That said, on this issue about his authoritarianism, the response that he gave on that abortion issue, about the importance of reasonable disagreement among morally conscientious people, boy, did that sound refreshing compared to the rest of those guys.
Yeah, which shows, how out of touch we are, at least with the Republican primary voter mind, because when I heard, he just got savaged for his performance in the first debate on abortion, and to me, and we talked about this in our last dialogue, that he's pretty close to my own position. He doesn't like abortion as a practice, but he thinks it ought to be up to the woman involved, and yet he also is, has his doubts about the kind of legal soundness of Roe versus Wade, but he's comfortable with the result it has produced, and he's generally uncomfortable, though, with the style of jurisprudence that led to it, so he would appoint justices that would probably take a dim view of it, but if they thought that the precedential value of it had sort of locked it in, he'd be okay with that, too. All of that captures my ambivalence, and I think the ambivalence of a lot of people, but it sure didn't play well.
Didn't play well at all, but I just want to emphasize that other point that he made, though. He believes everything that you just said, but to say so forthrightly, morally decent, conscientious, reasonable, non-evil, non-savage people disagree about this.
Right.
And when you've got that kind of conscientious, fundamental disagreement, you have to be careful, more than careful. You have to stay away from regulating the activity. That's a pretty that's a really important point. It's a fundamental point in this area, and I think he didn't have to say that.
No, I agree with you, and it's that.
Yeah, I know you agree with that.
And
I think it's just
that
important
attitude
to keep that
of
in the mix.
not demonizing the other guys is one that's in short supply in the recent red versus blue days. So any glimpse of moral seriousness about one's opponents is refreshing. Yeah, I would say, I think I mentioned last time that I've never voted for a Democrat for president. I've voted for Republican, and I've sat it out, and I voted for the Libertarian once and a half. But I am, at least actively considering voting for one of the Democrats this go round, and I would say I'm even leaning that way, and it's primarily because of the foreign policy issue, and this too for me is something very novel, because I was raised Cold War hawk, and I maintained those views through that era, and I think incorrectly applied that mindset to the post 9/11 world, and therefore supported the Iraq venture. I was completely mistaken about the WMD programs. I was totally confident at the time they were covering things up and that the programs would be much more advanced than anyone knew, and I was completely wrong. I also totally underestimated the horrible difficulty of occupying this sort of pseudo-country with all its warring factions, and that has blown up in our face. And so I'm quite, I don't like being spectacularly wrong about a really, really important issue, and it causes me to sort of slink back to my cave and really think hard and be chagrined and try not to get it wrong the next time and wonder what happened and what lessons I can learn from this.
What did happen? What are the lessons that come out of this? I mean, there are some people, for the narrowest lesson, let's cabin the lessons of this and let's say, don't elect Dick Cheney vice president.
Right.
Well, I don't think there's any danger of that.
No, we're done.
Okay? We're done with that. And he's not going to be president. But what are the larger lessons that you see emerging from this disaster?
I
have to say that when I have to be a little bit careful about what I say now because the colleague in the next office, Steve Krasner, just returned from 2 years as the policy planning director at the State Department, and I don't want Steve to get too mad at me about what I'm saying, but I do think that the war, as I've said this before in our conversations, was based on ignorance and arrogance, and probably more fundamentally arrogance, because I think it was the arrogance that drove the ignorance.
Yeah.
But what do you see, Brink, as the larger lessons that come out of this?
Yeah, I'm someone who doesn't really believe in, or I just have never been able to find solid ground in kind of big picture abstractions and sort of bedrock truths about foreign policy. I kind of feel like foreign policy is like management or investing. It's an art of being exquisitely sensitive to ever-changing circumstances of time and place, and you really can't boil down the wisdom much more than, like buy low, sell high. It's how you do that counts, and figuring out when it's possible. So, but in these particular circumstances that we're dealing with, which are the threat of Islamic terrorism, and in particular the threat of WMD terrorism, and B, the semi but not very related issue of rogue state nuclear proliferation. In these circumstances, I've learned a couple of things, which I think I should have known beforehand, but I know now. One is that our intelligence capabilities are nowhere near good enough for us to have a preventive war doctrine. And so the whole Bush doctrine, I think, is dead anyway. But notwithstanding the continued saber-rattling with Iran, and maybe that will come to pass. But the idea that we will have a sort of a general strategy of knocking out threats before they mature seems to me clearly just failed disastrously, not only because our intelligence was bad, but because we just didn't reckon on the overwhelming negative reaction that the world would have to our going it alone. So preventive war is out of my foreign policy toolkit. Preemptive war against an imminent threat, that's a different matter. And then secondly, I had thought before during the 90s when I was opposing the kind of ongoing foreign policy interventions, military interventions of the Clinton administration, I had thought that we aren't very good at nation building and occupying countries, and we should keep that to a bare minimum. In the particular circumstances of Iraq, in my kind of post 9/11 overreaction, I thought that it's a terrible, tough job, but the stakes are high enough. We ought to try it and get it right. And I had again underestimated the specific difficulties of doing it in Iraq. Anyway, we just aren't very good at that at all, and so any any foreign policy vision that counts on us kind of coming in and intervening and helping to do nation building, to build up institutions around the world, I think is just a bad idea, and I'm done with that.
I mean, I guess I think it would be, this is maybe an even narrower lesson, but I imagine that you would agree that it would have been hard for Israel to do nation building in Iraq.
Yes.
And in that region, the distinction between the United States and Israel is not that sharp a
That's right.
distinction. How a point of that importance and magnitude could have been missed at the time I guess it's beyond me. I don't know if you saw. Did you watch the Bill Moyers?
No, I did not see it.
The thing that was interesting, I thought it was very good, and the thing that was most interesting about it was not the complaints about Judith Miller and the more familiar story about the bad coverage in the run-up to the war. The more interesting piece of the story was about Knight Ridder. There were a couple of Knight Ridder reporters who were just doing their job, calling standard sources, being skeptical, checking things out. They were not sitting in Washington. They were not sitting in New York.
Right.
And it wasn't that hard. This is what they were saying and
Yeah.
what Moyers was emphasizing. It wasn't that hard for them to find out how much of what was being said was bullshit, including the WMD story when people looked at the tubes and they said couldn't possibly be for nuclear weapons, and just the basic kind of skepticism. I'm mentioning this with the Moyers partly because it goes back to the earlier discussion that we were having about the Jon Stewart show and what do we think
Yes.
about circumstances in which the most intelligent news show on television is a comedy show.
Right.
Great, brilliant, and it is a very good news show. But the extent to which people were just not doing their job, reporters, but also your basic big think people. Peter Beinart, he sort of apologized. He, pardon my language, fucked up big time. Not nearly, he didn't quite compete with Tom Friedman, who refused to be interviewed for the Moyers story, even though he thinks, he says in his column this morning, that, basically we better do something fast about dealing with Iraq or we can give up on America. Never a guy to lower the
right.
Rhetorical temperature, but not a crazy thing to think. I guess I think that there was, there is a basic fact that somehow got lost, I think, in 2003 in the run-up to the war, which is not a novel point, but it's that, war is a really, really bad thing, kills innocent people, whether you're intending to do it or not. It kills innocent people. It's the end of it for them. And soldiers on both sides, innocent civilians, that comes with the territory. So you only do it if you really have no other alternative. And that basic point about that you get out of the just war tradition, basic point about the morality of war, I think was lost. I do think that there was a kind of willingness to do this, despite some counter evidence, as an expression of a kind of vengefulness or toughness or breastbeating or whatever.
Yeah, I agree. I think that statecraft and statesmanship on the world stage is, as I said, in my way of thinking, is just plagued by utter baffling uncertainty, and you never have good information, and you never can replay the experiment to see how it would have gone the other way, and so as a result, what you see is really very heavily dependent upon your prior assumptions, and we had a couple of prior assumptions coming into dealing with Iraq, including people who Democrats and liberals who supported the war, and one was that we were freaked out by 9/11, and so having been chagrined at our inaction, or, that may have made us vulnerable to this. I know in my own case, I then recalibrated my weights of the risks of action and the risks of inaction. And so we were freaked out on that side, and then we were lulled by a series of easy wars during the 90s. The Gulf War one was just, it was a cakewalk from our perspective, and then, with the war in Kosovo, where we had zero casualties on this long air war from 30,000 feet. So for us, war had become something very sort of simple and bloodless, and I think you're right. We underestimated how grisly and messy it can be. And usually is.
Yeah, I mentioned before that there was a statement that I organized to put in the Times, and a lot of people signed it, and this was in March. It appeared in the Times on March 11th, 2003. I think I mentioned this. This was in about 60 hours. We got 14,000 signatures, and it was a statement of.
I had not known that you were involved with that.
Yeah, no, I organized it,
okay.
And I happened to have it in front of me, and I think it was right. I don't like admitting I'm wrong any more than you do, although It's not such a bad thing. But I don't mean to be an asshole in saying I was right, but I think it made the basic points. It was a very brief statement. It said our government is proposing a war against Iraq in the name of American national security, but no compelling evidence. Emphasis on compelling evidence. That's the kind of evidence you need.
Right.
No compelling evidence has been offered of an imminent threat to our security that would justify the use of military force. A war with Iraq will be a war of choice, not necessity. We condemn the Iraqi regime for its gross and persistent violations of the human rights of the Iraqi and Kurdish peoples and support efforts by the Iraqi opposition to create a democratic, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious Iraq. But we believe that the decision to wage war at this time is morally unacceptable and urge our government not to make it. That seems to me to have been the right thing. And what was really driving the statement was a sense of the kind of compelling evidence that you have to have if you're going to justify going to war in virtue of the human damage that it does, together, I guess, with a pretty strong expectation that came from thinking some about Iraq as a country, the nature of the place, the divisions within the place, about the kind of war that it would be, that it wouldn't be a cakewalk at all. And it wouldn't be a cakewalk partly because it would inevitably involve an occupation, and it's an occupation that would provoke a strong variety of forms of nationalist resistance. So, I mean, for me, the two big lessons are that this basic point about the morality of war is important to keep in mind, always ex ante,
yes.
Which is you don't do it except if you absolutely have to protect some absolutely fundamental value, and that you expect that if you're going to invade a country, and particularly if you're going to occupy the country, that what you're going to do is provoke a very strong nationalist response to that invasion and occupation. And you put those two things together, and it looks. But now, if you want to talk real disaster, let's carry this lesson over to Iran,
right?
Where there was a survey that was done sometime in the last decade, one of these world values surveys, and they were trying to make an assessment of the extent of nationalism in a variety of countries. The United States, you won't be shocked to hear, was number one. Number two was Iran. And we, in this latest issue of Boston Review, we have a series of articles on Iran.
Right.
It's all online. One is by Akbar Ganji, who was imprisoned for 6 years by the regime. He was originally a supporter of Khomeini, and he was a member of the Revolutionary Guard. He eventually became an investigative journalist, was imprisoned for 6 years. He went on a 85-day hunger strike, was finally out of prison as of about a year ago. And he's, I suppose, the leading Iranian Democrat. He
right.
won't go to the White House. He's refused invitations to come to the White House, and he wouldn't take any American money. We also have a piece by Hans Blix, the guy who was thrown out of Iraq in 2003, because he said there were no WMD. And his is more generally on nuclear disarmament issues, but also on Iraq. And then we have Nick Burns, who's the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, who was also in the Clinton administration and now is in the Bush administration. He's the third leading person in the State Department. And then two colleagues from here at Stanford, Mike McFaul and Abbas Milani. Mike is the head of the Center for Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law. Abbas Milani is the head of an Iran program here, but used to be a professor at the University of Tehran. And if I had to summarize in colloquial terms the Akbar Ganji argument, I would say his point to the Bush people, and probably to American politicians more generally, is, how about shut the fuck up? There is a strong Iranian democratic movement.
Which will only be undercut and undermined and delegitimized by being too closely associated with America.
With anything about the United States. It's the worst thing for the Iranian democratic movement if it's seen as associated with the United States. The point of the Hans Blix piece is, again, summarizing, this time less colloquially, but summarizing that there's a position that you can think of the Bush administration is taking, and it's a kind of hard position to take. It's, we need nuclear weapons, lots of them, for our security. In fact, we need a new generation of them. Point one. Point two, we are thinking of attacking you.
Yes.
Point three, you don't need them. Something missing from this picture, and what Blix thinks is missing from this picture is the idea of leading by example. If you don't want the Iranians to have nuclear weapons, how about building down instead of building up? How about downplaying the importance of nuclear weapons in the security strategy of, rich, modern or modernizing country? And how about reducing the threat level so that the argument for needing these weapons as for security looks like a less compelling argument? And that's also the McFaul and Milani argument. They are regime changers. They want to see democracy in Iran, but they think that the best strategy for regime change is not the threat strategy, but rather a strategy of diplomatic recognition, diplomatic relations, eliminating the economic sanctions, and saying to Iran, you've got to put everything on the table in negotiations, including domestic human rights issues as well as the nuclear issue. Not surprisingly, Nick Burns from the State Department has a different view of these matters, although he is very much on the negotiating end of the Bush administration, and I can't imagine that he was very happy when Commandante Cheney appeared on the aircraft carrier a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, as for me, I don't have confidence in putting my finger on any particular approach towards the Iranian issue right now and saying that's the right idea. I'm quite sure that a military strike right now is a terrible idea. And I'm quite sure that there is a gigantic distinction between the U.S. having a lot of nukes and Iran having any. And I think a world in which this Iranian regime has nuclear weapons is a worse world and a more dangerous world. But how to go about discouraging that, and how to go about the ultimately more important matter of encouraging a better regime in that country, I'm not sure how much leverage we have, and I think ultimately what we may just have to do is just outlast them and outweight them and contain them if they're causing trouble outside their borders.
The nice thing about the Ganji article, the important thing, is the extent to which he emphasizes the powerful Iranian democratic movement, if there is, and that the real fate of Iranian democracy, if there is to be Iranian democracy, depends on the efforts of people in that movement, and not principally on the efforts of the United States, although the United States can do a lot of damage to it. There is you shouldn't criticize, I guess, maybe you shouldn't criticize your own authors. But there's a different spirit in the Nick Burns article. It was very good of him to do this piece, and it makes a number of interesting points. But there's one thing that he says that I think expresses a very different sensibility, and I just want to mention it because I think this is the bad sensibility. He talks about the importance of Europe in the post-war foreign policy of the United States. He says now everything has changed for Americans' foreign policy vision. It had to. Europe, happily, is nearly what President George H.W. Bush predicted in 1989 it would become: whole, free, and at peace. And with the exception of the Balkans, Europe is democratic, united, and peaceful for the first time in several hundred years. Okay, now this is what he says. It is an enormous accomplishment to which both Democratic and Republican administrations contributed. Now, I suppose that's true, but for my taste, that puts a little bit too much weight on the contributions of the United States to those achievements in Western and now Eastern Europe as well, and not enough weight on the sustained, much more engaged, much more forceful activities of lots of people there. And if you start with the sensibility that the achievements in Europe are a consequence of efforts by the United States.
Yeah, but that's just the besetting sin of the leading superpower. We're always thinking, and everybody thinks everything is our fault or our responsibility. If the Israelis and Palestinians are at each other's throats, it's our fault for not mediating. If there's slaughter going on in Darfur, it's our fault for not intervening. It's just our lot but I grant you that it is important to step aside from that kind of default thinking and recognize that in certain very important issues in the world, our capacity to influence them is much more limited than we might think or might want.
Our capacity to influence them for the good.
Yeah,
our capacity to influence them for the bad may know no bounds.
Let me swing back. Let me swing back around.
But I actually am going to. We haven't gotten to our topic, or one of our topics, which is the immigration bill. But I do have to go in just a couple of minutes.
Yeah, so we'll talk about immigration some other day. Let me swing back around and talk about the Republicans and why I'm put out with them on this issue. Your March 2003 statement sounds very right now and very prescient, and you were right and I was wrong, and that's all there is to it. I would say just to take a little shine off your halo. There is this. When an investor beats the stock market by 20-fold, or a manager comes along and runs a company's stock value up through the roof, there's this fundamental attribution error that this guy must be a genius. He just must understand the world in some fantastic way. When in fact, there's a lot of people out there failing. He's in the right place at the right time with the right attributes, and it works. And so, in foreign affairs, the exact same characteristics, the sort of romantic streak and weakness for the bold maneuver that got Winston Churchill completely in trouble in World War I with the Gallipoli debacle. Those exact same personality characteristics were what made him the savior of Europe, in the 30s and then in World War II. So the fact is that in the sort of kaleidoscope of world affairs, the habits and instincts that serve you very well one time won't serve you well the next time. So the key is to be very nimble in recognizing when your priors aren't in sync with what's going on. And so to me, the most depressing thing about the Republicans isn't that they got Iraq wrong. We were in completely novel territory in post 9/11. We had just never been attacked like that. It really seemed. It was just, no one would have imagined on September 12th that we would have gotten this far without another major attack or just a whole series of attacks. So people were miscalculating on the basis of very imperfect information and on the basis of their prejudices. But once the information starts to come in, you gotta recalibrate, and to hear the GOP candidates celebrating Guantanamo and saber-rattling against Iran suggests that they think they've got all the answers. And anybody who thinks they've got all the answers in dealing with the current foreign policy environment is someone I don't trust at all.
I'm with you on that, but, and the but is nimbleness, a good thing. Openness to evidence, I'm all for it. Evidence-based foreign policy, all for it. Attentiveness to uncertainty, humility in the face of the facts, same page on that. I just want to come back to these two things, though. One is the basic principle that you don't go to war unless you have to. Because you keep in mind, war is... I don't think it's quite right to say war is hell, because that suggests that all moral bets are off in the conduct of war. But, war is really, really,
it's a
really
catastrophe,
bad,
right? Yeah.
It's a catastrophe, and you don't go in for a catastrophe unless there's just no other alternative. That's one thing. The second thing is, people have sensed that there was a certain, can we say, lack of humility there was this arrogance on the part of the Bush administration. Maybe that's but the generalizable lesson that I think they were missing is this point about the persistent importance of, broadly speaking, nationalist sentiments that maybe they weren't expecting to have to occupy this country, although that really looked like how things were going from early on. But you're going to occupy a country. It's not going to take long for the people in the country to not want you to occupy them. And you're going to have to face that kind of nationalist resistance. And I think, not that the only resistance to the United States or to the Iraqi government, such as it is in Iraq, is nationalist. No confusion on that point. But that's an important fueling element. Very important fueling element. And those two things, don't go to war unless you have to, and if you're going to fight a place, you're going to have to deal with that kind of basic predisposition, really basic and lasting, persistent predisposition on the part of the people in the country not to want you to be there.
Yeah.
Those are generalizable lessons.
Well, let's end up then on this note of agreement, because that's what I said were my two main takeaways from my errors about Iraq were preventive wars, or wars of choice. That is, wars where your back isn't completely up against the wall and you've got no real alternative. Yes. Those are off the table in my book, and occupations for nation building and imagining that you will have a compliant and willing and cooperative populace, that's out of my playbook as well.
Good to talk as ever, Brink.
Nice talking with you, Josh.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.